by Rose, who can introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Rose Martinez. I'm the Assistant Deputy for the data team here at the Council, and I'm excited to be presenting with Al and Nick today.
Hey, I'm Nick, Senior Data Scientist from the data team at the Council. I'm excited to talk about pay equity.
And thank you, guys. That is exactly what we'll be talking about today. So let's just jump right in. So to give you a brief outline of what we'll cover, we'll try to give you some context behind how this came to be, what the objective was, what the motivation was. Then we'll start off by presenting some of the findings in the beginning so that it can help acclimate you in understanding what the goal of the investigation is, and just give you some basis of what we're doing. We're going to dive into some recommendations that we found, and then finally, we'd like to have an open discussion between you and us about any ideas that could further our objectives of remedying what our findings have revealed. So to give you some context, pay equity has been a topic of concern for New York City within the New York City workforce for a very long time. It's been noted that there have been pay disparities within the workforce based on gender, race, or ethnicity. And the council members have been very eager to try to figure out, one, what's causing these pay disparities, and two, how to address the issue. And back in 2019, after many years of effort, former council member Lori Cumbo, who you see here in the picture, was finally successful in conjunction with some of her colleagues, Danique Miller and Carlina Rivera, also current council member Carlina Rivera, who you see in the background, in passing the local law 18 of 2019, which provides the council with access to PII, personally identifiable information. So because of the nature of the data, it was very difficult to pass. There were a lot of nuances that had to be ironed out, but that's what happened. And now the New York City Council is given API access to this data on an annual basis, and the city is now held accountable for correcting pay disparities in the city workforce, or at least that is the goal of local law 18 of 2019. So I guess I kind of jumped the gun, but yeah, that's exactly what the purpose of this law is. To first find through statistical investigation. It doesn't necessarily have to be confined to statistical investigation, but we have a hammer called data, and so everything is now a nail in our site. So our objective is to perform statistical investigation to find out the root cause. First, to find out whether there are pay disparities in the city workforce, and then try to work with the data to identify what the root causes are. And these disparities can be based on any protected category, such as race, gender, ethnicity, or age. And the data set covers all city agencies that are headed by a mayoral appointee. So this covers about 200,000 individuals that work for the New York City government. That is not everybody who works for the New York City government, but it's a large majority. The data, what does the data tell us? Just some main general findings is, one, if you look just at the pay for across gender and the pay across race and ethnicity, median pay, you see there is a huge difference in median pay for men versus women in the New York City workforce. And you see there's a huge difference between median pay across different races and ethnicities. That is just performing what I'll get into in the next slides with a very first look analysis of the data. But if you start digging in and you start, trying to account for the intricacies, the job title, the number of years of experience the person has, whether they're in a position of management, which agency they work for. You start to see that the large discrepancies start to shrink, and you find that employees with similar qualifications working the same job tend to get paid just about the same. Not exactly. There's still, even with accounting for all of the bits in the data, we still find some discrepancies, but the huge discrepancies that you see when just looking at the difference between men and women or different races and ethnicities tend to shrink by a large margin. Next slide. So I do see comments. So if anybody wants to, Nick or Rose, you want to jump in, I'm not able to read them because I'm going to focus on this, but do feel free to jump in. But so
JP just wanted to add that it can also be attributed to title level, which is true. Okay. That was a factor we included.
Yeah, we'll show all the factors that were included later on. We'll jump into that. I just kind of skimmed over it. So we now are trying to understand the problem. And one of the biggest things we found is that the differences in pay across race and gender that you see when you just analyze median pay by race or median pay by gender or ethnicity can be explained by occupational segregation. So when you see that there is a large difference across pay for different groups, even if it can be explained by the other variables, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's okay. You have to start asking questions. There is still a huge difference, and we have to understand why there is a huge difference. And so it seems like for a whole plethora of possible reasons, it could be that some jobs are harder for people of a certain ethnicity or race or gender to be employed in, or many conjectures can be made. But what we see is that if you account for the job title, a very large amount of the discrepancy in pay that you find across the genders, races, ethnicities collapses. So this leads us to believe that occupational segregation is really a key factor here. And so what this tells us is that the civil service title system, which helps try to address pay disparities, is actually doing its function when you look within the individual jobs or within the individual agencies. But that doesn't mean that we can create diversity just by having a civil service title system. Things are a lot more complex. And if we really want to get down to the bottom of the issue, we have to perform more investigation to understand why there are differences that yield this occupational segregation. We'll go on to the next slide. So some general recommendations. Identify jobs that are performing similar work but are paid differently. That's one thing off the bat a statistical analysis won't get. The statistical analysis doesn't know what people in different job titles are doing. It just knows that they have different job titles and work in potentially different agencies. Again, going back, if we can increase the diversity within agencies or within job titles, this issue of occupational segregation would also be addressed. We're going to go into a whole list of recommendations, and we also want to hear your recommendations for addressing this issue. So now we'll start getting into some of the modeling and analysis. I'll give a very brief overview before I hand it off to my colleagues, but you'll hear us saying adjusted and non-adjusted analyses. So an adjusted analysis means that, let me start with non-adjusted. A non-adjusted analysis means that we simply looked at the median between groups. We just looked at the median pay for Black individuals and the median pay for white individuals, and we looked at the difference. And we didn't adjust for any other factors. An adjusted analysis means that we ran a model that accounts for the person's title, the agency they work for, their title level, as was mentioned, the number of years of experience they have, their age, all of these factors at the same time to try to make an adjusted estimate for what their salary is expected to be given the full data set. To get a little more technical, we ran a mixed model. So a mixed model is a form of regression that allows for groupings that are correlated within the data. And so we have people that fall within the same agencies, people that fall within the same titles and title levels. And so we treat those with random effects in the mixed model, and while addressing the hierarchy of those levels. Fixed effects in the model were gender, race, ethnicity, which were combined for reasons due to specifications within the data. It was just much easier to handle the data that way. The age of an individual, the number of years of service in that position, and their managerial or supervisory status, whether they are a manager. And I think that is it. So now, I guess next slide, I'm going to hand it off. Sorry, I am not going to hand it off. This is also my slide. I apologize. So last bit that I will mention. So general findings. When we applied the mixed model, the unadjusted pay gap is huge, as you see at the top. You see that white individuals, white males specifically, if you can point it out with the cursor, Nick, white males make a substantially greater amount. I think it was like 20, let me just read it off because I'm forgetting the numbers, 73 to 85, like 22 or $12,000. I don't know how to math anymore. I'm sorry. But a very substantial amount greater than white females. And then you see the same trend across males and females throughout all races and ethnicities. And then on top of that, you see that white individuals out-earn Hispanic or Latino individuals, or I should say employees in the city workforce. And you see that there are very large differences across gender and race, ethnicity. But when you perform the adjusted analysis, and now you take into account the agency that a person is working for, the job title and such, those differences shrink dramatically. And what you see is here at the top where Nick is pointing, white females actually make 99.6 cents to the dollar that white males make. Hispanic or Latino females make also less than white females and less than white males and less than Hispanic or Latino males. And you see so on and so forth. You could look throughout the chart. The gap shrunk, but it's very much still there. And I should stress that even though it shrunk a lot, these minor relative to the unadjusted pay gap differences are actually huge. When you add them, if you were to add up the pay difference across the city workforce, we're talking about a large sum of money that is being diverted simply based on, I can't say that for 100%, but the data is insinuating that it's based on factors that should not, be impacting an individual's salary. And so our question is, how do we address that? How do we understand why that's happening? And also, don't forget that the gaps that we see in the unadjusted pay are also, they must be addressed. And again, that's where the occupational segregation and diversity that we were mentioning earlier is really relevant. All right. So with that, I'm going to now hand it off to Nick to talk more specifically about some findings, starting off with gender and civil service title code.
All right, thanks. And everybody, you can put questions in the chat. We'll try to answer them as they come up, if you'd like. So we're going to look specifically at gender and civil service title code now. And we're going to look at the numbers associated with some of those charts that Al was just showing. So if we look at it plainly, men are paid more than women. So men are paid on average $21,600 more than women. That's what we saw in that unadjusted chart that Al was just showing earlier. And that is a large amount of money. So, but we see when you do the adjusted pay gap and when you account for all the factors that we put in the model, men still make more, but a dramatic decrease in the amount that they make more. So men make $300 more on average after you account for all those factors that we were talking about, like your civil service title code, years of service, etc. So the reason we think that there is this dramatic shrinking of the gap is because of occupational segregation. So one thing we noticed is if you look at different jobs and you look at the proportion of women holding that job or the proportion of men holding that job, as the proportion of women within a civil service title increases, the average salary decreases. So jobs that are mostly held by women are being paid less. And men are employed in civil service titles that earn more. So you see the difference in proportion is associated with differences in salary. And that's a part of the occupational segregation problem. So now if we look at race and ethnicity, we're going to look similarly at adjusted and unadjusted. So the citywide unadjusted pay gap, again, we're just looking at the median salary of one race compared to the median salary of another race, no matter what job they're working. Black or African American workers on average make $27,700 less. And again, that's a substantial amount of money. And Hispanic or Latinx workers on average make $9,800 less than non-Hispanic Latinx workers. Then when we look at the adjusted pay gap, adjusting for those factors that we were talking about earlier again, civil service job title, age, years of experience, we see that Black or African American workers make about 1% less than white workers, and Hispanic or Latinx workers make 2% less than non-Hispanic Latinx workers. And we see a similar trend for race and ethnicity as we did for gender, where the jobs held by non-white individuals, predominantly by non-white individuals, are getting paid less than the jobs held by white individuals.
Oh, Nick, we got a question.
Okay, I can't see it, but if you could read it.
I can read it. Lynn asked, okay, go ahead.
Oh, I'm actually typing a response, but I guess I'll just speak to the response since, so that is a very, absolutely, yeah. And I think in most real world data analyses, you find that there are so many variables that the reality is you can't account for. But one of the things here that you do see is that you can glean a lot of useful information. For example, we were able to show that the civil service title system is performing its function. So that kind of, I don't want to say we absolved anybody of blame, but we were able to eliminate some of the false paths that somebody may go down for addressing the issue of pay disparities. And really what we're doing is we're trying to make the most use of the data that we can make. And it's not the answer to your question is yes, there are limitations, but we're trying to do the best we can within those limitations. And given how well the adjusted model responded to being able to address the pay disparities, or I guess mathematically, I should say, statistically address them, it gives us a fair amount of confidence in the results.
Yeah. To add that, for example, the variables that we do have that we accounted for, like age, years of experience, race, job title, we saw the model gave us, like within the same title, the pay gap is very small, that when we look at the median salary, we saw that there's still huge differences. So that sort of tells us that the model is working and that the variables that we do have is telling us what's going on in terms of people receiving the same pay within the title. So I think we can say with some confidence that people within the same title are receiving the same pay.
Right. As one example, you'll see that we looked at the results that came out of the model, and then we performed exploratory data analysis to support or verify those results. So when you do look at, for example, uniform titles, which we'll get into later, you do see that people within those uniform titles, regardless of gender, race, ethnicity, or whatever, are making similar salaries. Let me see. Okay. What are the biggest I apologize, Nick. What are the biggest one or two differences between men and women within this?
Can I just add on to the previous one really quick? So even if you just look at people within the same civil service title code without accounting for all the other variables that we talked about, you still find that the vast majority of them have extremely similar salaries, being within the same civil service title code, even not looking across any of the other variables that we included. So you see that pay gap shrink just based on that one, accounting for that one variable. And then, sorry, I didn't see what the other question was.
So what are the biggest one or two differences between men and women within the same job? The data is not detailed enough to tell us that. So the $300 difference that came out from the adjusted analysis is looking across many different jobs. It's not telling us that people within the same job. It's telling us that a man and a woman within the same job with the same qualifications would expect to have a $300 difference in salary if they're at the median. This is a hard point to get across, but not within. We know within the same job title that's not going to be true. But when you're accounting for the fact that there are many different job titles and many different other factors that fluctuate, you still see a small gap. That was a terrible explanation. I apologize if anybody wants to.
I just think that we're a little inconclusive on what that $300 difference can be
attributed
to. That's definitely something that we're looking at on this next report in the future, we're going to look into digging into that more. You could come up with some guesses on what's happening, but I don't know if we want to speculate too much without.
And just to add to that, now that we're looking into the data and it's making more questions arise, some of the recommendations is to have the data be more specific, have more data points be put into more variables added to the data set so that we can answer further questions that we think may be able to address that gap, that $300 gap.
All right, Nick, go ahead.
Great questions, though. They were good. So now we'll look at the relationship between age and gender. So this chart on the right, we have median salary by gender and age. So that red line is going to be female employees. The blue line is male employees. And as you go to the right, you're getting older. So we see that women's median earnings peak at about $7,000, while men's median earnings peaks close to $90,000. And you'll also notice that salaries of male employees over the age of 30 are much higher than those of female employees over the age of 30. So you'll see in this beginning part of the chart, the younger cohort or younger employees across the genders have very similar salaries, right? And then you see this pretty strong divergence here. And one reason that is commonly brought up for this divergence in salaries would be the motherhood penalty, in which women who disproportionately have two take care of children at home end up with lower salaries after having a child. There could be other reasons too, but that is a common one that's brought up. Differences in promotions and differences in jobs held. Okay, so let's look at some case studies that will go into some specific agencies to describe some of that occupational segregation that we were talking about. So if we look, again, we're looking at gender here and its relationship to Civil Service Title Code. We're going to look at the FDNY specifically, and we're going to look at their salaries by gender composition. So each one of these bars in the chart is a job in FDNY, and the proportion of blue in the bar is the proportion of men that hold that job, and the proportion of red is the proportion of women that hold that job. So you'll see on the far right, those all blue bars means those jobs are held entirely by men, and you'll also notice that those are the highest paying jobs in the FDNY. So higher paying civil service titles within the FDNY are consistently male dominated. So the FDNY in general has more males than females, but you'll see that at the top end of the pay scale, you'll see even a higher proportion of males compared to women, females. And these highest paying roles are all promotions from firefighter. And above the rank of lieutenant, there are no women. So those all blue bars at the top, you'll notice there's no red, there's no women in those jobs. And this a similar concept occurs in the NYPD and DOIT. So if we look at DSNY and we look across race and ethnicity, again, thinking about occupational segregation, DSNY is predominantly white and male. And you'll see here in the chart, we have title rank by race for the sanitation service occupational group. So we're thinking about sanitation worker and then going up to supervisor and then up to general superintendent. And this purple bar is the number of white employees. So you'll see it's over 50% white for sanitation worker, but a little bit more diverse. You have some Hispanic or Latino workers, or Black or African American workers here. But then as you go up the promotion ladder, you have a higher proportion of white employees. And then as you go up again, you have the overwhelming majority of employees being white compared to non-white workers. So there are a larger share of white workers with higher paid titles compared to the entry-level position of here. So we're thinking about who gets promoted and who is in the higher ranking position. And again, if we look at race and ethnicity, but this time for the NYPD, we have the title rank by race for the police service occupation group. So if we start here, police officer, and then you would move up to sergeant, lieutenant, captain, white workers make up the highest proportion, but there is diversity at this level. You have some Hispanic or Latino workers, Black workers. This one is unknown. But as you go up the promotion scale, you'll notice that the proportion of white workers increases and the proportion of non-white workers decreases. And these positions obviously are getting paid a larger amount than the police officer. So now for more case studies, I'm going to hand it off to Rose, who's going to talk about uniform versus non-uniformed employees.
So this case study, our question that we had in mind was, are there any pay differences between uniformed and non-uniformed employees? And here we define uniformed employees as uniformed titles within the city service, like, for example, police officers, sanitation workers, firefighters, and then civilian employees within NYPD or sanitation, and then other employees not part of those sort of agencies were grouped together as non-uniformed employees. And then what we wanted to see was what salary differences were there within these two populations and across gender. So we found that for non-uniformed titles, there was a $22,000 salary difference, where the line here in the middle for these box plots shows the median. So for non-uniformed men make around 67,000, while women make around 56,000. And this is sort of an example of occupational segregation where women take jobs that are paid less and men have jobs that pay more. But when women do find themselves in uniform titles, you find sort of what our model showed with like parity. Women do make the same within similar job titles. So men and women have the same median salary. So that was very interesting to see. So to add on to this occupational segregation, when we look at the counts, how many men and women are within these categories of uniformed and non-uniformed, we find that most uniformed employees are men, 80%. And while in non-uniform, there's more women than men, there's a little more than 50%. So women hold the majority of non-uniform titles and men hold the majority of uniform titles. And then when we look at race, there's a similar trend. So within the non-uniformed group, Black or African-American employees, there are more, there's a greater proportion of them within this non-uniform category with almost 40%. And then when we look at uniformed, Black or African-American employees are a little more than 15%, and white, there's much more, there's 40% uniformed white employees and then with non-uniform, there's 25% white. So this continues to show the occupational segregation case. Next slide. So for our final case study, we had this question about, does agency A pay more for the same job performed at agency B? So, we did a first try at identifying two positions that we thought perform the same job. So DOC officer versus DOP officers. And we looked at the salaries, the salary differences for the time within city service. And we see that for DOP and DOC, they begin around the same point, but then after 5 years, DOC officers jump up to about 85,000, while DOP officers are flat. And what we found and got more information about whether are these jobs the same? Should they be paid the same? We found that there's this factor of risk, and we found that DOC jobs are riskier than DOP jobs. So DOP works with probation population group, while DOC works, I think, with an inmate population group. So that could be explaining why there's this difference in salary between DOC and DOP. I guess next, or if there's any questions in the chat too. I think we got a question there.
Why was there a break in the chart? So if we can go back to the chart.
Yeah. So I knew we would get that question when we put this chart up. So a choice we made was do we want to cover that up? But I think there was just no data point, I believe, there or something there.
Nobody said 15 years.
Yeah.
In DOP.
Yeah. Happened
to be the quirk of the day.
Right. So the question was should I just smooth that over? But we just left it as is. I think there's more questions.
It's interesting when you look at across non-uniform positions.
I think there was one before that. What was the title specifically? I think just DOC officer and DOP officer. It would be in the report that we have.
Officer, essentially.
I think officer. Yeah. Al, you can go ahead.
It's interesting when you look across non-uniform positions, there would be a great gap between women and men. Interesting study it would be. Oh, you're proposing. That's a proposal. Nobody has worked exactly, I think it's 15 years here.
Yeah, 15.
In DOP. Rose, back to you.
Okay, so when we look at the demographic breakdown between DOC and DOP, we do see again things that support occupational segregation. So at DOP, DOP officers, they're 68% female, while DOC officers, they're 41% female. And then DOP officers, they are 65% Black or African American, while DOC officers, they are 35% Black or African American. So there's this sort of like pipeline or more white and men are within DOC than DOP and vice versa. Okay, so for a bird's eye view, so stepping back from these particular case studies, we had a question on how similar, so is the city's workforce reflective of the New York City population? If we go to the next slide, we decided to build a sort of this diversity metric. Are agencies matching or close to the New York City workforce, the New York City working population? Oh, I think we lost the slides. One moment.
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to put the interactive version up.
Okay, great. So just to state the New York City working population, the breakdown, they're 52% female, 22% Black, 29% Hispanic, 14% Asian, and 3% some other race. So here, there's two on the horizontal axis, we have gender, and then on the vertical axis, I have race and ethnicity. So 0 means that the agencies are closely in terms of distance and similarity. So they match New York City's population. So they're reflective of the New York City population, these agencies, while the ones farther away, their gender or race, or both race and gender, are very far away from what the New York City population, and they don't meet the diversity of the New York City population. So on the bright side, a lot of agencies fall within this like lower left quadrant, which means that they match both race and genders demographics to the city working population. But then we have some issue areas for gender exclusively, and then race exclusively, and then 2 agencies that have both race and gender issues potentially. So sanitation appears again. The fire department appears here. We also see that ACS shows up here with having, I think, more Black employees than higher on average than the city's working population. DOP here. I think we have a raised hand. Can we allow someone to ask a question? Or was that a mistake?
I don't see it anymore.
Okay, so I will continue. So going back to our slides. So to recap what that sort of diversity metric, so there's different ways to do a diversity analysis. This was one way we decided to go about. But in the meantime, I can mention that,
Yeah, he's here. He's still there.
I just got booted, sorry. I'll put it back up.
No problem.
But I don't have sharing.
Agreements anymore. How do I make you a co-host again?
I just made you a co-host. Do you have access now?
Yes, thank you. Oh, nope, disabled share.
I think that's because you signed out and signed back in. I just did it again. Try again.
I can do it now, thank you.
Great.
Okay, next slide when you can.
Oh, next slide. Okay.
Yeah. So here we pull out some of these agencies that were flagged in our chart. So NYPD, sanitation, fire department, DOIT, DOP, ACS, and DHS. So some of the ones that we didn't do a case study for, like DOIT, they have higher paid positions. Their higher paid positions are male dominated. Within ACS, it's a low paying agency, has a low median salary. It's highly staffed by Black women. And at DHS, it's another low paying agency. The median salary is low and it's highly staffed by Black employees. So I guess here comes like the question of what work do we value? And it seems that the more technical jobs like at DOIT, The protective service jobs, like within NYPD, are valued more than sort of like supportive caregiving jobs like ACS and DHS. Their titles may be lower in the pay scale compared to titles used by other agencies. I guess there could be a question where maybe they're performing the same jobs, but they have different titles. And that's another problem. The agencies with lower salaries, agency-specific titles, yeah.
And that was what the investigation between DOC and DOP was trying to get at.
Right.
Sorry. No, that's not. Those were the
No.
same title. You're talking about using different titles. My apologies. That would be something a comparable worth analysis would get at, though.
So with that, our next slide is about recommendations that the council have started to think about. So we have sort of like 5 buckets. So the job pipeline, how can we improve the job pipeline to diversify titles that are traditionally less diverse? The need to examine hiring practices. So are job ads not gender inclusive? So maybe like we know that women are less likely to apply to a job they feel less qualified, where men don't have that same issue. So maybe that's in the way we write job ads can help address that. And then comparative worth analysis, which is what we tried to start to do with the DOC and DOP comparison, but we feel like it needs a lot more investigation than just the data that we have. And then examining the civil service exam system. Here's a sort of to address that $300 pay gap or maybe other issues, like the pay scale issues that some of you guys have brought up. And then legislation. So the council is a legislative body. One way the council can help address pay inequities is through legislation. And I think that is our last slide. And I think we open up for questions, ideas. If someone wants to speak, they can. And here's our info if anyone wants to reach us. And we will be sharing the slides via email. So Nick sent a morning reminder email today. So we'll send one after the meeting.
I'm gonna go ahead with a shameless plug as people think up of any questions. And I'm just gonna throw out there that the council data team is hiring. And if anybody knows anybody that may be interested, you can forward them to the New York City Council website where you can find the application. And this is a preview of some of the stuff we work on. But yeah.
I was just going to say, if you have a link, put it in the chat, and we'll also be sure to put that in our daily newsletter to Open Data Week attendees.
Fantastic. I will do that right now.
Oh, has the link been updated to the version we want?
It will still be the same link. We are.
But I think could people put.
Okay, we can save it to put out whatever day you want us to put it out. But
there are. I think this is absolutely related. So we're gonna discuss it. We use what's called a gender decoder. We can thank Rose and her colleagues for doing this. It takes the resume and it analyzes the words. I think it's pretty simple. It just reads through the words and it sees whether the job application is masculine or feminine coded, whether it encourages more men or women to apply. And what we found is that the way we had originally written it was very masculine coded, strongly masculine coded. And then we've updated it. We accidentally used the old version, which is why we're updating it, but it'll be updated on the website. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Do you have info on that, the decoder as well?
We can drop that. We can drop a link. Yeah, for sure.
That's super cool. Yeah. And thank